Hey everybody, how would you like to meet Jared Diamond? And I mean not just meet him, but hang out with him every day for almost 2 weeks. Here's how you can do it. As you know, the Skeptic Society helps to organize geo tours and trips around the world to various interesting places, each trip of which has a special guest lecturer. The next one coming up is September 23rd to October 10th. Iceland, Greenland, and Nova Scotia on a cruise ship. Every day you can hang out with Jared Diamond as he'll be lecturing on all these different places, as well as on his various interests in these areas. And you can just hang out with him at meals and during the excursions. And I have to tell you, I've known Jared a long time, and I cherish every time I get to hang out with him for a couple hours. Here you can do it for almost 2 weeks. It's a great deal. Go to skeptic.com and click on our Geo Tour page. September 23rd, October 10th, this year, 2024, on this Arctic excursion, Iceland, Greenland, and Nova Scotia, with the great Jared Diamond. Check it out. Will, nice to see you. Where are you? You're in England, right?
I'm in West London right now. Thank you so much for having me.
What are you doing there? How did you get? What's your journey? Give us your story, your origin story.
How far back should we start on this? I guess I grew up in Colorado, up in the mountains. Did my undergrad at the University of Denver, grad school at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, up in Canada. And then I spent, I think, 7 years at the University of Kentucky as an assistant and then associate prof, and then ended up over here, switched jobs a few years back. I'm at Brunel University London in the Center for Culture and Evolution, which is like a really cool interdisciplinary group of a dozen to 15 of us culture and evolution nerds.
I forgot to introduce your new book. The reason you're on here, Disbelief: The Origin of Atheism in a Religious Species. By the way, I love that cover because of the abandoned church. Abandoned churches really are gorgeous, though, aren't they? They do kind of give that ambiance of ancient wisdom or something, deep history.
There is something about them. They have a certain mystique and aura to them. I love them.
Yeah, my wife's from Cologne, Germany, so every time we go to the dome there, and it is magnificent. I mean, like you, I'm an atheist, but I get chills going in there. I don't know, there's something about the air, the temperature, the light through the stained glass windows, the organ, the candles. I don't know. They figured it out a long time ago. It had to really move people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I especially like kind of the older churches where you can like smell the antiquity on them. I love it.
Yeah.
The last chapter in the book I wrote, and it takes place in a nice old church in downtown London.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I was driving south on the 101 here through Oxnard, Ventura and Oxnard. There's a huge church on the side of the building. It could just be a strip mall, you know. It has nothing to do with like this ancient, beautiful ambiance there. All right. So, in your origin story, I mean, people probably always ask you this. You wrote a book on atheism. How did you become an atheist? Or were your parents religious, or were they atheist? Or what's your story on that?
My atheism origin story. So yeah, I am an atheist. I describe myself as either agnostic or atheist. In one chapter in the book, I say, hey, you can be both. You don't have to choose between agnosticism or atheism. Um, I grew up kind of nominally Christian. We'd go to church from time to time. My brother and I did Sunday school a couple times, and it didn't really stick. We grew up kind of up in the mountains in Colorado, a bit west of Denver, and religion was around, but it wasn't like an over the top religious spot. So I saw it. We'd go to church, especially if like relatives were coming through town. Uh, and I didn't think that deeply about it. I was curious about religion, but I never introspected about my own religious beliefs that much, really until university. And I can kind of vividly remember it was in my first year of university. We had a cool honors program at the University of Denver where you'd take like ancient Greek mythology alongside Greek political philosophy. Or, they'd kind of pair things in an interdisciplinary manner. And one semester, I took a class called Modern Religious Thought, which sounded kind of fun. I was curious about religion. And it ended up being kind of a tour of Western theology for the most part. But towards the end, there's a discussion board component of the class where the professor would ask us a guiding question each week, and we'd kind of argue with each other in the discussion room associated with the class. And towards the end, the question was, does God exist? And that was the first I kind of like really thought through it in a rigorous way, and I realized, no, I don't believe in God. And it was kind of at the end of a semester where we had, gone through the problem of evil, various, ontological arguments. But I didn't find any of them all that convincing, kind of from a neutral perspective. And so in the discussion board, I kind of typed like, no, I don't really think God exists, and I'm not super compelled by any of the kind of rational argumentation we've seen. And that doesn't really seem like how you pick a religion anyway, necessarily. So that was the first time where I kind of openly said, yeah, I don't think I believe. And I think one other student in the class was kind of a fellow atheist, and there were only 15 or 20 of us, so it wasn't a large class. But everybody else was religious, at least for the purposes of the class discussion board. And yeah, and kind of as we argued back and forth throughout the week on the discussion board, I I can't quite decide if I became more convinced or just realized that religion had never really been for me, and actually discussing it with people kind of laid bare my atheism that had been kind of hiding latent for a while.
Yeah, well, this gets to your theory that you present in the book. By the way, I read your whole book and I loved it. I think it's one of the best books I've read, not just on atheism, because there aren't that many, but on why anybody believes in God at all. Because as you point out, to be an atheist, there has to be something you're atheist about, which is theism. So there has to be that in the first place. So, I mean, you talked about the problem of evil and so on. You presented it in kind of an intellectual way, which is how I usually talk about my own atheism as well. But in fact, is it really more of just a temperament thing also? Like, I just don't really, not feeling it, don't need this as a worldview. Doesn't vibe for me. And the people I hang out with are not believers anyway. And is it more emotional or intuitive in that sense?
Yeah, well, first off, thank you for kind of the compliments on the book. It's my first time writing a book, so I love it when people say they liked it. Um, yeah, so I mean, this is something that I've kind of grappled with both doing the research and writing the book is a lot of the times this is presented as a rational debate where, side A presents their reasons, side B tries to rebut them or present new evidence. And I don't think that's how most beliefs actually get formed. I think, as you mentioned, you can see if it just feels right. Does it kind of mesh with the rest of your approach to the world? Kind of social and cultural cues are also huge. So we look around and say, well, other people in my group, what are they doing? What do they seem to believe in? And not just what do they believe in, but what does their behavior tell me they actually believe on the inside? Because there's a lot of kind of cheap talk in the world. Anybody can say they believe anything they want. That doesn't mean you should necessarily believe them about their beliefs. You need to see kind of credible actions backing up their talk. And that goes a long way. We've found, and a lot of other people doing large scale surveys, it's those kind of credible behavioral cues that match with what people are saying about their beliefs. That's what's powerful in kind of influencing the beliefs of others.
Yeah. I do a lot of God debates, and one thing I do at the beginning is say, all right, if these are usually in churches or whatever, and I always have a show of hands, how many of you believe in, everybody hands go up except one guy over here, I'm here for you, Shermer. Okay, thank you. Right. So I say, well, okay, let's say at the end of the evening, you were convinced that my arguments were better than the other guys, the theists. Would you abandon your Christianity and decide Jesus was not your savior? And it's like, no. It's like, okay, then what are we actually doing here, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's kind
those...
of how it. That's how it felt in the discussion board too. Like nobody changed their mind. I think we got a bit more entrenched in our beliefs, and each side had fun, kind of saying, "Well, this argument suits my side better. That one, sure, you can have that one if you want." But the argument didn't change anyone's mind.
Yeah, I think of those arguments, the first cause and the prime mover and the ontological argument and the cosmological argument, all those things, the fine-tunedness and intelligent design theory and all that, as reasons to believe if you already believe. It's just like, okay, I already believe, but now here's a good set of arguments. Sort of like if I was a conservative or a liberal and you said, why are you a conservative? I'm not going to say, well, my parents were, or I don't know, it just feels good. I would say, oh, well, because these are my positions on gun control and immigration and abortion, and that's my team, right? I would give you arguments.
Yeah, exactly. So many of these debates across topics, and certainly religion and atheism can attract these sorts of debates. It sounds like a debate where each side's trying to convince the other, but it's kind of like each person's throwing more coal on their confirmation bias machine and just getting it fueled up. And I'll make the right arguments for my team, and you make the arguments for your team. And we're not actually trying to persuade each other of anything to change each other's minds. We're signaling to our teams for a lot of these debates.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we're recording this here at the end of July, and Kamala Harris just raised $200 million to run ads. Well, 99% of the voters have already decided which team they're voting for. So who's going to be influenced by those ads? I guess it's the undecided voters. So in a way, what you're studying in atheism is kind of, I don't know, or agnostics or whatever. It's sort of the undecided voters, or the people that said, I don't believe, but go ahead, give me your arguments. see if you can convince me.
Yeah, I suspect too on a lot of the vote stuff. I think a lot of theirs is like getting people who might otherwise not vote to vote, which there's less of a direct I don't know, but yeah, those numbers on the donations were staggering too, because there was a lot of small donor, first time donor, a lot of
Yeah.
volunteers. It's interesting.
But reading your book, I was thinking about this just as a little sidebar here on the research by political psychologists who study why people are conservative or liberal. Most of the social, this already, social psychologists that study this are liberal, and they're studying why people are conservative, almost like why people get cancer. How could you possibly be? What is wrong with these people's cognition, right? And of course, they're not happy to hear that. But one of the threads is that you are kind of by temperament gravitating toward one left or right, roughly speaking, whichever country you're in, of a worldview that's, I don't know, more open and tolerant and less hierarchical and structured and so on, and therefore and you feel good with that worldview in your head, and you migrate toward people that share that, and that happens to be the Democratic Party or whatever. And vice versa. If you're conservative, you like hierarchy and rule of law and respect for authority. All that Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory. Those are the kind of things that feel good in your head, that mesh with your temperament. And that happens to be the Republican Party, so I'm going to be a vote Republican. But in fact, you've already gravitated toward that just by temperament. It just feels good. This worldview. So what I'm getting at here is, go ahead and riff on this for a while if you want, is that what religion is like? People pick religions not by their arguments or they have the best rituals or food or whatever. These are my people. I feel good about being with them. And some of us don't need any of that. We feel good with being people that aren't religious at all.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose if we're trying to figure out how most people come by their particular religious beliefs, our first pass at understanding that just has to be, what are the religious beliefs of the people they grew up around? So if you grow up somewhere and your family belongs to a certain religion, the surrounding community tends to belong to that particular religion. Community leaders all profess faith in that religion, and then people are tangibly acting on it. In the cultural evolution world, they call this a credibility enhancing display. It's basically, walking the walk instead of just talking the talk. So if you're growing up and you see all these cultural cues that, my family says, believe in this God. My neighbors say, believe in this God. Most people in the community say, we all believe in this God, so I can conform with them and believe in that same God. And it's backed by these credible actions. It's overwhelmingly likely that I'm going to end up religious and believing in the same God as everyone. So we tend to pick up so many of these norms and beliefs just from our surrounding cultures. What's interesting then is, so that makes sense if that's a world where everybody's believing in just one God. The choice is like, all right, I'm going to believe in God just like everybody else. It gets a bit more interesting if you live in kind of more pluralistic communities where now you're seeing different subsets of your community credibly proving faith to different gods. Now you've got a lot of different signals coming in, and it becomes a bit trickier to figure out, well, which one should I believe in? But yeah, to a first pass, everybody tends to believe in kind of the gods of their surrounding community, however we define community. And I suspect, and a point I try to make at several points in the book is, I think we could think of there being different ways that people become atheists. And one of them is just not getting consistent, solid cues to believe in any given God. So it's not necessarily we need like atheist indoctrination to get people, young kids start, read your Darwin, things like that. That's not really how it works. It's if the consistency in religious cues isn't there, then atheism becomes a bit more likely. I think I described atheism as kind of like it's the basin we fall to unless consistent cultural cues push us towards any one God, which somewhat departs from some earlier work in the psychology of religion. It would describe, religion is an intuitive default, and atheism takes, consistent cognitive or cultural effort, and you need some sort of special ingredient to get an atheist, whereas the default human is religious. And in the book, I tried to flip it and say, well, no, like if we're going to talk about defaults, it takes cultural work to get any particular religion to work, and atheism is just what happens when you don't get all the cues lined up.
Right. Yeah, that's so interesting. So, yeah, default to truth theory. So, default to God or default to no God. Yeah, most of the research in this area, which you summarized nicely, leans toward these cognitive features in which we find invisible hidden agents, patterns, hyperagency detection, and genes for the God module of the brain or whatever. If you want to review some of those, wouldn't that support the default to God? That's the baseline, and then atheists have to overcome that. Or how do you think about those?
Yeah, so I think that general conclusion would fall neatly out of there's a group of researchers that it was called the cognitive science of religion for a while. And there a lot of people would still say, oh yeah, I do cognitive science of religion. It's kind of a catch-all term. But that work, a lot of it was coming out kind of late 90s, early 2000s, where they're trying to figure out why is it that most people are religious? And then why do different religions around the world have some kind of deep underlying similarities? So most religions describe a God that's some sort of an intentional agent that you can interact with in meaningful ways. A lot of the times that God provides some sort of explanatory purpose, that God helps explain why the world is the way it is. These gods have kind of quirky, counterintuitive skill sets, right? Like if I'm a person has the properties of a physical object, right? They can't walk through walls, gravity holds them to the floor. But then they also have kind of human psychology, and we have different cognitive systems for tracking physical stuff, and a separate system for tracking psychology. So, like, we'd call it theory of mind or mentalizing. That's how we track other people's mental states. So we have these different systems that can track stuff, and the supernatural agents of world religions, they tend to largely fit this template of like a person has these skills. They act like, they have this psychology, but they can violate stuff on the physics side, right? If we have a ghost, it's basically a person. You could chat with it. It has the same wants and desires, but it could walk through a wall or it can turn invisible. So it's the slight violations of our expectations that are really common across world religions. So the cognitive science of religion approach kind of said, well, what is it about human psychology that makes it so people everywhere believe in gods, and the gods end up looking kind of like this template of it's an intentional agent we can interact with, but it probably has a kind of quirky and counterintuitive skill set. And so they hit on the idea that religion might emerge as just kind of an evolutionary byproduct. So we evolved to have, cognitive systems for tracking physical objects. That's our kind of intuitive physics. And then we have separate cognitive machinery for tracking the social stuff. And maybe the kind of default settings on these different cognitive systems, just as a weird emergent property, they make it so that supernatural agent concepts are memorable, they're interesting. We like talking about supernatural agents. We have an easy time remembering them. And so this gives them kind of a boost in cultural transmission. So yeah, the cognitive science of religion group really hit on things emerge, religious beliefs emerge as cognitive byproducts. And they would say that religion comes naturally. It's mostly supported by intuitive processing. And atheism, on the other hand, uh, in that work, you don't see as many explicit, clear predictions where they say, here's what atheism is all about. You might see like a token chapter in a book. But the general conclusion there was that religion comes easily, whereas atheism must take work. If it runs against the grains of all of our kind of evolved low level cognitive biases, maybe atheists are just good at kind of explicitly buckling down and rationally thinking things through. And they're atheists because they've escaped their kind of intuitive pull to be religious. Um, and I think as we've done the research over the last decade or so, that view has been less and less prominent, that you get, full-fledged religion just from these low-level cognitive biases. In part because, it's good at explaining why we might see certain similarities across religions, but it also leaves a lot of questions unanswered. So why is it that some religions have spread and conquered the globe, whereas most religions kind of fizzle and fade pretty quickly? So we can't necessarily explain that by just saying, oh, it's these low-level intuitions. Well, why are the intuitions favoring, Christianity over some sect that we've never heard of because it lasted 2 months? Um, some of the other problems with that is some people would say, all right, any concepts that just kind of fit with our cognitive machinery, that'll be a good fit and we'll believe in it. And that's where we get religion. Um, but this raises some problems where, at least since like the 2000s, people in this world have talked about the Mickey Mouse problem. So Mickey Mouse is a counterintuitive supernatural agent. He's a talking mouse. That's not something we encounter every day. But he's an intentional agent. You could have a conversation with Mickey if he, existed. And he'd be memorable, but nobody believes in Mickey. So we've built a model for explaining belief that's all about these memory biases. But that explains the popularity of concepts, but not necessarily, people actually believing that this is real, being willing to fight or die for Mickey Mouse. Nobody does that because we've all just agreed, like, yeah, Mickey's interesting, but he's not real, and nobody believes in Mickey. Um, so if we're just relying on kind of low-level cognitive biases and intuitions, we have a hard time explaining why Mickey Mouse is not a god, for instance. Or we'd have a hard time explaining, well, what about Santa Claus? He's an interesting one because I think you could make a pretty compelling case that Santa is a god for kids who believe in Santa. He's a real supernatural agent. He really is morally concerned. Are you naughty or are you nice? And he can reward or punish accordingly. But adults tend not to believe in Santa. So his content stayed the same. Presumably, those kind of representational contents are still interacting with our psychology and tripping all the right intuitions. But between childhood and adulthood, most people stop believing in Santa. So it can't just be the intuitions producing belief. Or people who believe in one religion, they don't learn about a God from another religion and start believing in that God. So if it was all just about, some supernatural agent concepts are so sticky, they get stuck in our head and now we believe in them, then why is it that, Christians don't read about Zeus and start believing in Zeus? If the contents of the idea of Zeus were sufficient to produce belief, then how come you or I don't read about Zeus today and start believing in him? So those are some of the puzzles that really, yeah, we started doing work on this kind of in my mid-grad school days, where we realized this canonical cognitive science of religion, cognitive byproduct approach can't quite answer all the puzzles we wanted to answer. And it was a great start. I think it really helped us kind of, as a field, say, all right, we need to break religion down into smaller, simpler chunks that we can then link to cognition and then test hypotheses about that. But as is often the case in science, we kind of hit the limit of what we could explain with just the intuition. And that's where the kind of full theoretical arsenal of cultural evolution came in really handy.
Yeah. Man, that is super important and interesting. And the other thing I like about your book is you break down different concepts that people tend to overlap, like atheism itself. Let me just read from your book. Atheism is no more than disbelief in gods. It is the state of not believing in any god or gods. It is the absence of theistic belief, atheism. Atheism is not dogmatic certainty that there are no gods. It is not moral opposition to religion. Between these covers, atheists are just beings that don't believe in gods. That's all. And that is really important because people just, again, just personal examples of, so you don't believe, you're an atheist. You don't believe in right and wrong and morals and values. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah,
I'm just an atheist.
You don't believe in love? You're like, what?
Yes. Yeah. And, so that's why I call myself a humanist or secular humanist, or more recently, Enlightenment humanism has a little more gravitas. I'm a classical liberal politically. I believe in rights and civil rights and women's rights and gay rights. I believe in equal treatment under the law. I believe, I in love. I believe in love, right? And they're like, oh, but you're an atheist. I thought you were an atheist. Or, as you also point out, so you claim there's no God. No, that's not. I don't know. So there's different versions of this, right? Strong atheism, I believe there is no God, versus weak atheism, I just don't believe in a God. There may be one, I just don't see the evidence for it, but go ahead and show me or whatever.
Yeah, in the book, I tried to shoot for a simple enough definition that was also broad. I guess I kind of went for a weak atheism. Like, it's just the absence. I'm not trying to say anything positive of these people disliking religion or being certain or not believing in love or something like that. Just, do you believe in
Yeah.
God? No? Okay, atheist.
And then I also like you make a distinction between kind of the metaphysical or ontological question, is there a God out there? And then the epistemological question, how do we know what's true about anything? And can we know about that one in particular? And so I'm happy to say, well, I don't believe in God, but I don't know everything because I'm not omniscient. So I could be wrong. And therefore, I'm agnostic in the sense that Huxley meant it when he coined the term in 1869, not knowable. It's not a soluble problem that scientists and philosophers can answer. And it seems to me that because, just based on kind of sociologically, that there's all these arguments back and forth. The theists have their arguments, the atheists have their arguments. And Martin Gardner used to say, he was a fideist. He believed in God, even though he was one of the founders of the modern skeptics movement. And he said, I even think the atheists have slightly better arguments than the theists, but only slightly. The theist arguments are not that bad, and it makes a difference in my life. I'm not trying to talk you into anything. You don't have to believe. I'm not saying I can prove it. I'm just saying I personally believe. Okay. So that's a very different thing. You might say I'm an agnostic in that sense. It's just not a knowable thing. So go ahead and believe whatever you believe, and I'm going to believe what I believe, and that's it.
Yeah, that was the point I tried to make in the book, because, I'll get feedback when we field a survey or when I give a talk. A lot of the times people say, well, I wouldn't say I'm an atheist. I'm agnostic. Where do I fit in? If I'm trying to, we'll have, studies, for example, trying to estimate the global prevalence of atheists. People say, well, I'm an agnostic. Do I count in the atheist pile or the not atheist pile? Or we'll look at work on moral distrust of atheists. And people say, well, I'm not an atheist. I'm agnostic. Do people trust me? Um, and so I tried to make a point in the book that these are not mutually incompatible categories. It's not, you don't have to pick the atheist box or the agnostic box. You can be both. You can be atheist and agnostic. You can be a theist and agnostic, because agnosticism is basically just saying, I don't think we can know the ultimate truth on this. Um, and so instead of necessarily framing that as uncertainty per se, in the book I wanted to say, no, agnosticism can be its own principled philosophical stance that epistemologically we can't prove or disprove this. And that's totally separate from whether or not you believe the thing actually exists. Like if we're talking about, Russell's teapot out there orbiting, yeah, he says we have to be agnostic about that, but he's not telling you should believe it's out there, right? So we can easily separate belief versus disbelief from the principled stance that we can't prove these things.
Yeah.
So yeah, I kind of selfishly hope that sticks in the book where people can separate the agnosticism one out.
Really important that the conversation shift away from this kind of stronger version of atheism. I mean, I've been old enough now to see all this unfold in my own adult career of, in the 70s and 80s, the whole God question wasn't really a thing. The creationism was kind of old, young earth creationism, so no one really took it seriously. And it really wasn't until Dawkins' book in 2006, The God Delusion, that really made it a big thing. Which are you? Pick a side. And then there was a division between, are you militant atheists? Are you in the camp with Dawkins and Hitchens, and you're going to get them by, like the bulldog, and you're going to go for it? And I was more like Dennett, like more of an intellectual process, and belief in belief. Yeah, I don't believe, but I believe you believe, and that's fine. And so on. And then, or the Jeannie Scott, head of the National Science Center for Science Education, who was kind of the big debunker of creationism, but she was super nice about it, and go ahead and believe in God if you want. I don't care. But then after Dawkins' book, it really put it on the map. It's like, you got to be more militant. Come on, get out there. And oh, wow. And then, I don't know, around 2009, 10 or so, then there was the Atheist Plus movement. The plus being social justice. Then it became politicized. Like, oh my God, here we go.
Yeah, it's interesting seeing how these kind of social movements take different aspects of it and run with it over time. Sometimes with the same cast of characters over successive years. Yeah, I remember when God Delusion came out. That was like my first years of graduate school, right as I was starting to study this stuff and realizing that there wasn't a ton of research on atheism. There's a weird moment where I was like, this seems to be in the news a lot. And you'd see like survey results out there where atheists were super distrusted. And just a surprising, there's not a huge topic within psychology, my home field. Even the psychology of religion wasn't a particularly big or prestigious landing spot as a psychologist. And then atheism was like, that's even weirder than just the normal psych of religion stuff. So it's been interesting seeing kind of the science develop in parallel as, God delusion in those books just kind of, that was, fanning the fires of culture war around religion. And you're right, you saw the quick emergence of, I think, anti-theism almost claimed the atheism mantle for a while. Yeah.
Yeah, then Richard was given his Atheist of the Year award, which I always thought was kind of funny. He's like, this is the guy who didn't believe in God the most all year. Not once did he believe in God. We're going to give him this trophy.
The least belief.
Now, since then, I see he's changed it to, the person that promotes science and reason or something like that, which is more positive, right? Yeah. Okay, then the other distinction you make in the book that's important is the difference between being religious or believing in God or not. And so, when the rise of the nuns happened, the people that tick the box for no religious affiliation, people, oh my God, are they becoming atheists? No, they're probably not becoming atheists. They're just not going to church or whatever. So talk a little bit about how you as a social scientist measure these things. How do you know how many people go to church or how many people really believe in God or not? It's all self-report data. I mean, how do we know?
Yeah, I mean, self-report data, it's one of these ones where it's not the best data, but it's the data we have the most of for a lot of things. But I mean, so we can track it in different ways. One of them, you mentioned kind of the rise of the nuns, and that's where we'd see a lot of surveys coming out where they'll ask people, what's your religion? And you could say, well, I'm Catholic or I'm Protestant or I'm Muslim, or, there's this whole menu and you check a box. And a lot of the times you'll have an atheist box and an agnostic box, and then one that's just none. And so, yeah, you'd see a lot of coverage with, the rise of the nuns, none is up to whatever, 20% in this country or that country. And a lot of people would rapidly assume, these people are atheists. Whereas it turns out in our surveys, if I look at the people who tick the none box, most of them still believe in it. Just for whatever reason, they've decided to no longer identify as this or that type of religious person. And then some of them, depending on what other kind of menu items were in that checklist, a lot of them would be kind of spiritual but not religious. So they hold various, sometimes kind of idiosyncratic supernatural beliefs, but it's not kind of orthodox religion, so they would identify as none. And then you'd get a lot of, say, atheists who don't want to use the word atheist, so they might also check the none box. Or people who feel a bit more agnostic about it, they might end up in the none category. So that ends up being a weird it's a weird mixture of people in the none box. So I always have scratched my heads when you'd see like headlines saying, it's the rise of the nuns. And I'm like, but that's like a rise of an artifact of how you asked a social identity question. And a lot of people didn't see something more compelling. So they checked that one because it's what's left. In my work, I try to, say, all right, a lot of people treat the word atheist as a loaded term. They don't want to positively identify as an atheist, especially if they're, in the States or somewhere, kind of a majority religious country. So they don't want to tell me they're an atheist. So sometimes you can look at large scale surveys where they'll ask people, do you believe in God? And they'll phrase that in different ways. Do you believe in God or a higher power or something like that? And then they just give people a yes, no answer. And so that one, I can just check the people who say no. And I'll say, all right, I'm going to count those people as atheists because they have said they don't believe in God. And, right there in whatever it was, the preface of the book, I said, atheists are people who don't believe in God. So they get counted as an atheist. But then an additional challenge is across a couple of sets of studies now, we found that even just like a large scale survey where, the telephone poll, somebody calls a stranger, hey, do you believe in God? Yes, no. That's still something where somebody has to verbalize to a stranger, I don't believe in God, which we've just mentioned that's kind of a socially loaded thing. So we've suspected that people might be going undercounted. Yeah.
One second. If it's an anonymous survey, no one is going to know. Why would anybody lie about that? Or what's the internal psychology there?
Yeah, that's always a weird one where, I mean, this survey person can basically guarantee they'll never be able to connect this person's name to that survey. It's anonymous coming in, it's anonymous going out. But I think psychologically, if you're on the other end of the phone, you're having a conversation with another human. You might be able to kind of rationally convince yourself, yes, this is fully anonymous, but it's not subjectively anonymous. Like you and I right now are having a conversation. Even if all of our names were blurred out, it's still me and you having a conversation. So all those social cues are there. So I think we have a hard time thinking about kind of true survey company guaranteed anonymity, especially if the actual interaction is like a phone conversation. Although interestingly, in our surveys, we found some evidence that potentially just people responding to the survey via the internet, where now they're not even having a conversation; they're just clicking something with their mouse. Um, and our current data is showing that even that kind of a survey might be undercounting the number of atheists because a lot of people are just really reluctant to positively indicate that they don't believe in God.
And would
Um,
part of that be just your own self perception of what kind of person you see yourself as? And you've inculcated all the negative stereotypes about atheists, and you think, well, I'm not one of those. Of course, I don't believe in God, but I don't want to be an atheist. I just don't believe in God, but I'm not an atheist. Yeah. So maybe there's an internal psychology there.
Yeah, I suppose a lot of it could be, we've internalized this notion that, atheists are bad and morally questionable. Or even if I haven't fully internalized that and believe it myself, I might just be aware of kind of prevailing cultural norms that, atheists are looked down upon in this community. I wouldn't want to do anything to look like one of those. And if that's kind of your mindset going through life is, regardless of my personal beliefs, I don't want to get called one of those, then you get this online survey and you respond like you're just trying to get to the end of it, right? So you click through, you see the do you believe in God one, and you're, whatever, I'll click yes, why not? Because it's low stakes, people can put whatever answer they want. But when we've tried kind of indirect ways to measure it, that's where we start finding higher and higher rates of atheism kind of in aggregate estimates. If we can find ways to let people indicate to us that they don't believe in God without them having to do it just by a direct self-report.
Yeah, I've had some sex researchers on the show that talk about the same problem. Anonymous, completely anonymous, but do you watch porn, or have you ever cheated on your spouse, or how many sex partners have you had? They have the same problem. They know they're not getting accurate information, and they have to do other strategies to try to get the real number.
Yeah, it ends up being kind of a fun scientific problem because it's like, well, on one level, just figuring out do people believe in God, that should be easy. We can ask them. And then maybe you could find some corrections for socially desirable responding. But kind of the more you chew on it, the harder it gets to just ask a simple question in a way that will give you answers that you can work with and trust, especially if it's a socially loaded question like God. Or I can imagine, sex researchers have that. People who study drug use, problem drinking, you can't just ask people these things because everybody wants to pad things a bit in this kind of socially positive direction.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about why people believe in God to a certain extent and how many. So just give us a rough number. How many atheists do you think there are using all the strategies you have to try to get an accurate number in the United States and or worldwide, or maybe the Western world?
So we can start. Let's start with the US just because we can illustrate kind of the data problem first. So in the US, if we wanted to figure out what percentage of the US population are atheists, um, so the first work I did on this problem was around 2017, 2018. So around that time, Gallup and Pew had large scale surveys out. These are big, reputable firms. They do proper nationally representative sampling. And one of them around this time was saying, all right, it's around 2 to 3% atheists. And for that one, they used kind of the menu approach. Are you Catholic, Protestant, whatever else? And there was an atheist box in there. 2 to 3% of people ticked the atheist box. The other survey company had a survey around the same time with the do you believe in God, yes or no item. And that one, the number was 10 to 12%. So how many people in the US are atheists? Well, it's either 3% or call it 11%, depending on how you've asked the question. And that one we thought, well, even then we might be getting that 11%, even if we take that as the upper bound. That might be too low because of what we were just talking about, where it doesn't feel anonymous for people to do this. So we used a task that we found over in kind of sociology and criminology, a task that can give you population level estimates of the prevalence of things that no individual wants to fess up to. So the methodology would work like this. You get a couple thousand people, you randomly split them into two groups. What kind of socially sanctioned thing would we make this version about? Should we do problem drinking, or I don't know? We'll do one for drinking and driving. Okay, if we wanted to estimate the population prevalence of drunk driving, we could just ask people, have you had too much to drink and then hop behind the wheel of a car? And some people might say yes, and a lot of people who have done that are going to say no. And they might in their heads they say, well, that was only one time, or it was only a few drinks, or it was after the Super Bowl, who wasn't? People can give themselves out. So what we would do is we get a couple thousand people, randomly split them into two groups, and we say, all right, I'm going to give you a list of statements. And in your head, just count how many of these statements are true for you. You don't have to tell me, which ones. And then random assignment into two groups. So one group, they just get kind of boring statements. So I'll give you 5 statements. You tell me how many are true for you. I brush my teeth every day. My favorite color is red. I was born on a Tuesday. I've set foot on the moon. I own a pogo stick. So, I have my 1,000 people in that experimental condition, and they just give me a number. Some people are a 2, some people are a 3, some people are a 1. I don't know who has a pogo stick on that list. I just have a number for each person. And then the people in our our experimental condition, exact same task. We give them a list. You just tell me how many are true for you. Only now, let's see if I can recreate my 5. It was, I brush my teeth every day. I was born on a Tuesday. I own a pogo stick. My favorite color is red.
Walk on the moon.
I've set foot on the moon. I've had too much alcohol and driven a car. So those people get 6, right? So they got our same 5, and then the one we care about. And then the difference in average scores between the two groups, that's how many people got this one and said yes to it. So that should, if between our two groups, if the average score in the 6 item list is 2.5 and the average score in the 5 item list is 2.2, the difference is 0.3. So we're saying, all right, 30% of these people have been drunk driving before. So that's the task. It's kind of, it's sneaky and indirect, but nobody has to tell us I've driven drunk. In my studies, nobody has to tell me I don't believe in God. It's just that 6th item is about belief in God. With Maxine Nafe, who was a student working with me at that time, she has her PhD and is actually in survey research now in the US, which is pretty cool. So we fielded a couple of surveys in the US around 2018, and our estimate on that indirect estimate was 26% was our best guess for atheist prevalence in the US. And again, that's against a baseline at the time where the big survey companies were saying 3% or 11%, and we're saying, well, actually, it could be a lot higher. It could be higher than 1 in 4. So our guess, circa 2018, would have been around 25% atheist in the US. If we use, again, a pretty soft definition of atheism, just people who don't believe in God, and if you measure it in a way where people don't have to directly tell you. That one, so we've been refining that method over the last, I guess it's been 5-6 years since then. And so we just actually collected new data again in the United States, but we also added a few other countries just to see, like, do we get this gap between self-reports and indirect estimates other places? And in US on those ones, I believe our indirect measurement of atheist prevalence is up over 30% now, just a few years later. So the numbers are going up overall on both kind of indirect and direct measurements, but especially we still find the gap between kind of the self-report and indirect. In that one, I mentioned that we also are expanding that and checking in different countries. So with this a bigger project with some collaborators, we've been trying to run the same basic experimental design, that unmatched count, in the United States and also in Argentina, France, China, Saudi Arabia, and Indonesia. So we wanted some places where prevailing cultural norms are strongly pro-religious, where atheism is socially and potentially legally problematic. Then we also wanted some places like France and China where atheism is pretty normative, and then US and Argentina are kind of in between on those. And so we thought it would be interesting. Well, one prediction is we should see a gap between self-reports and those indirect measures like we found in the US. That gap should be, you'd expect, pretty large in places like Saudi Arabia or Indonesia, where anybody who is an atheist is probably hiding it socially. And then we would have guessed in China and France that if there's a gap, like, because atheism is pretty commonplace. So if there's a gap, it should be small. So self-report should be high in a little gap. And we're still crunching the number. Probably sometime this fall, that paper will be out. But so far we've found, yeah, it does look like the indirect estimate is a little bit higher everywhere. So even in France and China, there's a few closeted atheists. The U.S. and Argentina, they look pretty comparable to each other, where we're still looking at 30% atheist on the indirect, and more people showing up on indirect estimates than self-report. And then we're double and triple checking the data in Saudi Arabia and Indonesia. I think we can't give like an overall number because the survey company we worked with couldn't guarantee like full representativeness for the country. So our samples skew a bit more urban, affluent, and educated. But we're finding in those atheism rates on the indirect measure that are substantially higher than self-reports, kind of what we'd expect, where to the extent that there's atheists in these places, they're pretty quiet about it. So we're not seeing numbers quite as high as like the US, but we're still seeing
Yeah.
more atheists most places than are turning up in the surveys.
So this makes me wonder if the so-called spike in nuns and everybody's scrambling to figure out what happened. And of course, conservatives are saying it's because you took prayer out of schools or something like this, right? Maybe it really isn't as big a spike as everybody thinks it is because it was a product of the survey techniques from, say, 20, 30 years ago to how they're done now.
Yeah, I suspect that there's an element of truth to that. And in part, I think in the first studies with Maxine, we were able to look across different demographic splits. So we could look at different kind of age and generation cohorts. And I think among like baby boomers, we'd see, I couldn't remember the exact numbers, but it was like we'd see 8% of them are self-reporting as atheists, but it's still 22% on the indirect. Whereas the younger generations, it was like 22% self-report, 27% on the indirect. So it did seem like one thing driving this spike in the nuns is in part, it looks like our younger generations are just kind of a bit more open about their disbelief for various methodological, or, it could just be that the culture has changed and people are more comfortable being open about these things now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's more acceptable, socially acceptable to not be a believer in God. I just had a funny thought. What if Buzz Aldrin took your survey? Have you ever set foot on the moon? Yes, as a matter of fact, I have.
He'd be the one person who like answers six, all of them. Like,
yes,
like, fair enough.
Who is this guy? Let's check this guy out. Yeah. Okay, then that addresses another one of these sociological problems of the difference between America as a standout religious nation from all the other industrial democracies, most notably in Northern European countries, where their religiosity rates plummeted after World War II and were pretty low by the 60s and 70s, whereas ours, at least by, say, 2000 or so, were still astronomically high. So the puzzle was, why are Americans so religious? And then everybody digs through our past, or they look for this cause or that cause, poverty, or the social safety net isn't very good. So religions have to step in to do what governments are doing in European countries to take care of the poor and so on. It's sort of privatized social security and welfare. And or then the opposite, the other theory, let me see, it was the kind of trickle down. Because we have separation church and state, the government doesn't support religion, so they have to compete amongst themselves. So the market drives religions to be more relevant. And so you get these mega churches where they have, like rock concerts and babysitting and free parking, right? And chicken. And, it's a big party. And, so they have to do that because they have to compete. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that problem?
Yeah, it's interesting for trying to figure out why, if you take a pick for what economic index you want, per capita GDP or something, you plot that on the x-axis, and then you have like percentage of the population who prays daily or something like that. You'll have this nice tight trend line where it's like the more wealthy countries tend to be less religious by just about any measure of wealth or religion. And then, here's our graph. You got like the US way up here in the corner as this extreme outlier where super wealthy, still way more religious than you'd expect on wealth alone. Um, and as you mentioned, so there's kind of the stark notion of where you don't have a state religion in the US, you have kind of competition among religions for adherence. So we've kind of amped things up, and maybe it's just recruiting people more. I think that that explanation, in some ways, hasn't fared empirically well because it's not. It does an okay job at explaining the US, but then it starts doing a poor job of explaining everywhere else. So you need a scientific explanation that's going to fit both. By my read, kind of the best explanation is, we saw secularization kind of post-war Western Europe, in part because They had a fair amount of wealth, but wealth alone doesn't kind of drive religion away. Instead, it's they invested the wealth in more of a social safety net. You saw kind of a narrowing of inequality, and it seems like one thing that really fuels religious fervor worldwide is kind of uncertainty and precarity in just people's everyday experiences. So Norris and Engelhardt term this existential security. So they'll say, well, Western Europe did a good job of providing for just kind of everyday existential security for citizens. And what seems to happen is under those conditions, people are just a bit less motivated by religion. Doesn't mean overnight they wake up and they're like, well, I have healthcare, so I'm an atheist now. Instead, it's as you see kind of more a social safety net, people are just a bit less publicly excited about religion. You don't see these big religious rituals as much. People are engaging in fear of these credibility enhancing displays, proving their faith, even though they might still privately believe. But what happens then is kind of the next generation of cultural learners. They're growing up and they're seeing this kind of religiously complacent society where, the religious fires aren't burning quite as bright. So they might think, well, why should I believe in any of this? You almost see this kind of like 2-generation process where secularization kicks in as you get kind of reinvestment of wealth to level inequalities. You get kind of a period where David Boas would call it fuzzy fidelity, where people are still, they might still believe, but they're kind of like lukewarm on the public side of religiosity. And then it's the next generation of learners who just kind of doesn't develop belief. So that's the 2-stage process we've seen and speculated about. And that seems to explain these broad trend lines well. How does that account for the US? In the US, we have massive amounts of wealth if you measure it on, say, per capita GDP, but relative to Europe, more of the money is held by fewer of the people. So if you kind of consider like what's, average Joe Q citizen that you pluck off the streets, their day-to-day, moment-to-moment existence might be a lot more precarious than per capita GDP or something like that would explain. So if you look at sort of an inequality-adjusted GDP, US is less of an outlier. So that's what seems to have been a fairly successful theoretical model for explaining patterns in secularization over time.
Interesting. And then what about the history of religion? And let's talk a little bit about, is it an adaptive function of our evolution through, say, group selection, much like everybody that dances together or they do something in unison, group cohesion, or it's a social signal that if you see me going through the rituals every week, you can trust me, and it serves some function there, or then you can present the byproduct, what Steve Pinker calls the cheesecake theory, although that's an old example now. It's this sort of add-on, like maybe music or dance itself is not adaptive. Maybe it's just the cheesecake. It's an accidental byproduct, and we just get it like lucky us. But there's no adaptive reason why we should be able to do those things or do calculus or something like that. Why should we understand quantum physics? I mean, this is a byproduct of something else, right? Anyway, go ahead and riff on that, on the history of religion.
Yeah, so do we want to think of religion as an adaptation for something? Does it achieve some kind of evolutionary function for us, or is it more of a byproduct? The answer to that question that I pursue in the book is both. So I think the capacity to have supernatural beliefs about gods very much looks like a byproduct of, we evolved to have cognition good at tracking social relationships, good at tracking physical stuff. So the various gadgets we have in our head that we collectively call human nature, they interact in a way that makes it easy for us to think about gods. We like thinking about gods. We didn't have to evolve to have brains that are good at thinking about gods, but we did, and that's kind of cool. So there's the capacity for belief. But if we imagine, lots of different groups of people, and each group kind of has their own religious beliefs, that sets the stage for us to have different religions out in the world with different norms around reproduction, with different norms around cooperation, with different, believing in different types of gods. Some of them believe in a big moralizing God who can see what you're doing and they care what you're doing and they can punish bad behavior. So if we think of kind of each little culture with its own religion popping up as a different experiment in how religion works, and we could think of religion as kind of a norm accelerator. So each group has their norms about reproduction, cooperation, warfare, whatever. religion just kind of amps up commitment to that. But some groups are going to hit on collections of religious beliefs and practices and norms that might ease group tensions. They get it so people aren't fighting with each other. Some types of beliefs might be good for cementing in-group cooperation. Some religious practices and norms are going to promote reproduction or child rearing. So if we think of each kind of little group with its own religion having different sets of beliefs and practices on these things, some of them will do better than others. So over kind of a cultural group selection, we could picture different cultural groups kind of sinking or swimming based on their norms, their beliefs. And where that intersects with religion, the evidence, I mean, we can debate some of the timing on some of these, but there's a case has been made by like R. Norenzayan, Joe Henrich, some others, that some types of religious beliefs, especially beliefs in big moralizing gods, can pair with, credibility enhancing displays and religious rituals to ramp up cooperation within groups. And it's good to be a member of a cooperative group. Cooperative groups would be able to outcompete less cooperative groups. So a lot of this research has focused on the relationship between certain types of religious beliefs and cooperation. And I find some of the experimental work on that fine. I find some of it, not believable. But so that's one story that we could spin about cooperation, that beliefs in some types of gods makes people a bit more cooperative. And that helps groups that hold beliefs in that types of gods, so those religions spread. But you could do the same sort of kind of thought experiment thinking through, instead of cooperation, we could talk about religious beliefs about, say, a reproduction. That one feels like a dial that we could dial up or down. And it's pretty easy to see how norms that either promote or inhibit reproduction are going to have a direct effect on kind of the success of that group. So kind of a classic comparison there is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, kind of a Christian offshoot, started in the eastern U.S. and then eventually they spread to Utah. And now we had whatever it is, 20 million people worldwide subscribe to this religion, and you could compare that to a different kind of religious group that started in roughly the same time, started catching on in the same part of the world, the Shakers, and they might have had 10,000 people kind of at their heyday, and now they're down to just a few surviving practicing Quakers. And we could look and say, well, what about norms around religion? So the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, very much pro reproduction, have kids early, take care of kids. They've spread very quickly. The Shakers, well, they practiced universal celibacy. So it's not that hard to, plot those two trend lines over time and see who's going to do better. So ultimately, that's a religious norm, a religious enforced norm around reproduction that just directly can affect the survival of these groups over time. So we could think of, all the different cultural groups out there with different religions. Some of them will have collections of practices and beliefs that might be better for cooperation, reproduction. Missionary outreach would be huge for religion. Some of them spread just by convincing other people to join. So if we think of each religion kind of trying out different combinations, some of them will do well, some of them won't. The winners are going to spread. The losers we haven't heard of because they're gone or they've been kind of enveloped by one of the more successful groups.
Yeah. The Mormon story I find interesting. In the polygamy phase of their church, I've often made fun of Smith and his falling in love with this other woman. He's happily married, but he's just a guy, and it's like, well, I like this other one too, and how am I going to justify this? Oh, I know, I got a revelation from God. He told me I have to do this. Okay, honey, I've been talking to God, and you're not going to believe this. He said that I have to know. So I was telling this story in a kind of snarky way to David Buss, who studies evolutionary psychology, mating differences between males and females. And he said, well, Joseph Smith is just a typical guy. He just wants lots of sex partners. We know from the data, men want more sex partners than women, and men can have sex with, much more freely than women can, so on and so forth. So he kind of corrected me and said, it's not, don't make fun of him. He's just doing what guys do, and he just found a way around, a work around his guilt, right? But it's also an interesting kind of political sociological story, because then they got a new revelation when the state of Utah wanted to become a state. the union, and the federal government said, yeah, but you can't have this polygamy thing. We're not doing that. That's not what we do here. And they're like, okay. And then they got a new revelation from God. Okay. So, that's an interesting, interaction between religion and politics, and dealing with human nature as well. You have a discussion of group selection. I've read all the literature on that stuff. I tend to side with Pinker and Dawkins on that. But it seems to me maybe it's an artificial debate. I mean, everything you just described, why can't that just be cultural group selection? Why do you have to throw it in the camp of evolutionary theory, and there has to be some genetic way to understand it?
Well, in the book, I did frame it as a cultural group selection thing. So I think a lot of the kind of popular debate going back to, as far back as we want to go, but I think kind of the most recent time it resurfaced was the Pinker Edge article where he said, away with group selection. It's not a useful scientific concept. We kind of threw it by the wayside back in the 70s. And what I found interesting then, so that was 2012 ballpark, I think, when he wrote that, and it spawned a bunch of commentaries where people wrote in, and the people who wrote commentaries, you said, hold on, let's keep group selection, like don't throw it out entirely. They tended to be theoretical biologists who actually do evolutionary modeling, and a lot of them would talk about it as, group selection is just a modeling convention. It's one way to partition variants. And sometimes you add a group structure to it, and that makes things go a bit better. Or you could stick with kind of, orthodox gene's eye view, inclusive fitness. But a lot of the times you can translate back and forth between the two modeling conventions. So I could start with, say, Hamilton's rule. I could derive that from something like the price equation, which is like a mainstay of group selection thing. So I think there's more commonality to these two approaches than some of the critiques of group selection might be willing to acknowledge, that, I can get their stuff starting from a group selection starting point. And so I think also too, if you go back to, say, in the 70s, when kind of old naive group selection was being, rightfully kicked out, a lot of that was, lemmings committing suicide for the good of the species and all that. And none of that works that way. And we know that now. But part of it was, so it was 1970 or so is when Price published his work, which, the Price equation shows how you could model stuff as group selection. But looking through his, working through the formula, you see, all right, you get a between groups component and a within groups component. And for something like genetic selection, if you've got reasonable amounts of migration between groups, you don't maintain enough variability between the groups. So basically, the groups aren't groupish enough to get sort of an emergent group level process going. So then, sure, just describe it as individual level selection. Whereas I think cultural group selection is an easier sell on the group selection angle, because cultural transmission makes it easier to maintain group boundaries. So if I migrate from one group to another, I bring my genes as they are, and they'll get shuffled into the genetic deck of that group. But if I move into a new group, I can quickly change my beliefs and practices to fit in. So I can conform, and that kind of maintains distinctions between groups. So that gives us the between group variability that keeps this group selection process going. And I think that's an easier sell at the cultural level than the genetic level.
That makes sense. Yeah. So let's think ourselves back into a twilight of thousands of years ago, or tens of thousands, back to the EEA, the environment of our evolutionary adaptiveness, whenever that was. I mean, Pinker has a funny discussion with Tooby and Cosmides here at UC Santa Barbara about when did that actually end? Because the birth control pill was 1961, so you could take the EEA all the way up to 1961. Right. So, it's another one of these fuzzy concepts. But, in terms of like group selection and what adaptive function religion has. So in here, I'm thinking of Jared Diamond's analysis of conflict resolution amongst hunter-gatherers, like in Papua New Guinea that he is engaged with. If you have just a couple dozen people in a tribe or a group, small band, you can have conflict resolution. Everybody just gets together on Friday afternoon and we sit in the quad and we hash out our differences and we settle it that way. But once you start scaling up to hundreds or thousands, then the number of dyadic potential conflicts just is astronomically high. It goes up exponentially. You can't do it in the quad there, right? So you need a big man. So the chiefdom, the chief of the chiefdom, that kind of thing. So to what extent is religion also rising around the same time as governments? Here's a list of all the laws, and here's the punishments for the laws. And by the way, if you think you got away with it because we didn't have any of our gendarmes or police around, there's an eye in the sky that sees everything, right? So this is kind of the moral enforcement, big God's theory, right, of religion. So what do you make of all that?
Yes, I mean the big gods approach would just be kind of as you were saying, in small enough groups, it's easy enough to keep each other honest. As the groups get bigger, it gets harder to keep each other honest directly. Even more kind of indirect forms of reciprocity, it gets harder to track. We just don't have the headspace to keep track of everybody in the group, who's naughty, who's nice. So potentially what could have filled that gap is these beliefs in big moralizing gods. And people like Ben Brzezinski have pointed out it's not the case that there's religions out there with totally morally unconcerned and morally fickle gods. You said, gods everywhere moralize, but in a lot of cultural groups, gods, they just have limited purview. Like they can see what's going on in the village. They can punish you here in minor ways, but they don't have these big kind of universal moral concerns where they care what you do everywhere, no matter when you do it. They care what you think about. They can see if you're doing stuff, outside of the village limits, and they can punish that. And so that could have really helped kind of accelerate cooperation in our group. So as groups get larger and more cooperative, then we could start actually building more of these kind of formal institutions for promoting cooperation. So at least in the big gods theory, I think some of them would say you'd see religions kind of giving groups a bit of a push towards getting bigger and more complex. And then pretty rapidly, you start seeing these other institutions that can also help out. And then, if you fast forward that for whatever, 10,000 years or so, you'll see places like, Western Europe, where now all of the cementing cooperation stuff is done by the secular institutions currently, and religion can fade away. But it might have taken religion to get that initial boost because those institutions themselves each one of those is its own cooperative dilemma. So, having police, well, now you need what's keeping them honest. Okay, you can have somebody evaluate them, but what's keeping that guy honest? So you just kind of get more and more levels to spread it across. But once you have kind of, trustworthy secular institutions in place, that's one of the kind of bellwethers for where we see religion then start to fade. People seem to be able to trade off between, trust in secular institutions and trust in religion.
Yeah, so trust is a big factor there. How do you think about the divine right of kings? Is that just a way for politicians to give themselves more power?
That would just feel a bit self-serving, right? Like God told me I can do whatever I want.
Yeah, exactly.
You got to listen to me now, guys. I don't know. It's weird that he said that, but
that's right. I mean, it seems so obvious, but that was a big move for the United States to say, okay, we're not going to do that anymore. To throw that
exactly.
off.
We're going to pick leaders and maybe constrain them somehow. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, but in other words, I think as far back as you want to go, religion and politics has always been intertwined, and it's only recent that we've begun to try to separate them. And even that, as you know, just from current events, Project 2025, we got to get God back in the classrooms and in our public courtrooms and so on. Like in Louisiana, just passed that law, which will probably not be held up because the ACLU is already suing for that. But that, again, seems like one of those strong impulses that people have. We want our religion, the dominant religion, to have extra political favors because it's what makes our country great, something like that. It's really hard to knock that out of the system and just, we have a secular government. No, we don't. If you listen to people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, it's like Jesus co-wrote the Constitution. I mean, he was right there with Jefferson and come on.
Let's fact check that. Yeah.
I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I mean, that's kind of how they feel. That feels to me like, it's so deeply ingrained, almost like the free speech issue. You have to constantly fight for it because whoever's in power would love to censor people that are critical of them. It just seems to be human nature to want to do that.
Yeah, it does seem to be. And it does seem like throughout history, like various leaders of various groups have loved to say, and God's on my side. It seems to like add a bit of extra juice to whatever the argument is. Yeah. And sometimes it seems transparently self-serving, but it's such a common move that you see all over the place.
Yeah. And none of these issues, like the abortion issue, or maybe, I don't know, food rituals or whatever, there's arguments made that these are actually adaptive, practical religious rituals that serve purposes. Like you shouldn't mix these fibers or these kinds of foods because thousands of years ago that made sense. That the kind of desire to control female reproductivity. I mean, this is one of my arguments for the pro-choice thing, is that men have always wanted to do that. And you have to push back against that impulse, and maybe that goes back to our religions. We need more babies, and there's only two ways to grow our religion: missionary work or fecundity, right? And so we have to keep track of what our females are doing, or in the case of gays, you're taking people out of the reproductive gene pool two at a time. No good. We can't have this, right? That would be an argument that there's a practical reason why homophobia was so strong for so long.
Yeah, I mean, in the book, I talk about just how religion can kind of amplify various things. I mean, a lot of these could just be kind of a cynical politicians realizing, oh, I can tap God on this, and all of a sudden it's got a bit of extra oomph.
Mm.
Well, we can't discount that these are just sincere believers. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, I mean, pro-lifers don't like it when I say that because they go,
Yeah,
we're against abortion because it's murder. You're murdering a human being. That's the only reason I don't believe it, but I can't get inside people's heads and say, you just really want to control female reproductive. That's what men have always wanted to do. Right. Anyway, it's just one of those weird things. All right. So let's return to Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory in his book, The Righteous Mind. You discussed that in your book. And so there's a set of kind of moral foundations about what you think is important. And then those kind of roughly divided between liberals and conservatives. So liberals are more concerned about fairness and justice and taking care of the little guy and people that need help. And conservatives are more emphasis on flag and family and authority and rule of law and hierarchy and so on. Why is it breaking out that way? And what has religion got to do with that in terms of like the moral foundations of religion?
so I discuss moral foundations briefly in the book, mostly because I borrowed liberally from some of Haidt's experimental stimuli in a couple of studies where
Mm.
he describes people violating each of the moral foundations. Um, and within the moral foundations framework, as you mentioned, he kind of pins down five, or we might be up to six or more foundations now that he would say these are kind of the building blocks of moral thinking, and they fall across different categories. And in the book, he had five, and I think they were just starting to talk about liberty as a sixth. Um, and yeah, so I would call this moral foundations framework instead of theory because I don't think it has the theoretical depth we'd want from a scientific theory, but it's a nice kind of descriptive classification of stuff in the moral domain. And so in his work, it breaks down into a nice five-factor solution. Other people have kind of checked morality in different ways, even using some of his questionnaires. So you don't always get that nice, tidy five-factor solution, but a lot of times you can break it down into two. So you have, in Haidt's work, you'd call it the binding foundations, and then the individualizing foundations. So everybody agrees that, say, harm and fairness are moral concerns. They might disagree over how we define fairness, but everybody would be on board with, don't hurt people for fun, don't cheat people. Um, so for liberals, at least in US, political liberals tend to say that's morality. Harm stuff and fairness stuff, that's morality. Political conservatives in the US would say, well, what about loyalty to my group? So flag burning, stuff like that. Conservatives would moralize it. Liberals would be like, well, it's a piece of fabric. It's flammable. You can burn it. Go nuts. Ditto with respect for authority. Conservatives moralize it. Liberals tend not to. And then Haidt and them have the purity or sanctity foundation, which is kind of like there's a natural order to the world, and you get a lot of sexual morality gets lumped into that. It's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. That's purity based morality right there. So those three, the kind of loyalty to the in group, respect for authority, and purity concerns, conservatives, they still value the harm and fairness stuff, but they kind of put those on the same level, if not a bit higher. Um, in terms of how that plays out with religion, uh, so people, at least in a US setting, who are more religious, they're going to also be endorsing those for the most part. Like it's all correlational stuff. But more religious tends to look like the political conservatives, which isn't super surprising because at least in the US, um, at least among white participants, you see more religious tends to be more conservative. You'll see some flips with, for instance, African Americans. Sometimes it's more religious ends up being more liberal, and there's a kind of history story there. A lot of the civil rights movements were religious leaders. It was religiously mobilized to you get kind of a flip in the relationship between religion and politics for easily explainable historical reasons. So yeah, within the moral foundations framework, religious people tend to look kind of more like the conservatives in the classic height stuff, where they're endorsing purity, harm, fairness, loyalty to in-group, respect for authority.
Yeah. It's important to note that conservatives, liberals, they believe in all five. It's just the emphasis, how strong the one factor should be over the other. And the reason Jonathan added liberty is because when he was before he was writing his book, he was talking about this, and I pointed out to him, libertarians, don't forget the libertarians. They have one dimension, liberty. I want to just be left alone, and I don't care what anybody else does. Okay. So, I think that is a factor, but it's a pretty small one, why the libertarians never get much toehold in politics. But, this does tie... I was going to say, for people, listeners not familiar with Jonathan's thought experiments that he presents to subjects, they're really quite amusing. But very revealing. Like one of them is Mark and Julie go on a vacation together, their brother and sister. And they decided it would be fun if they had sex, just to try it out, to see how they liked it. And they had a great time. It was really very fulfilling for both of them. They decided that it'd be a one-off thing. They used 2 forms of birth control so they wouldn't get pregnant. They didn't have STDs. Nobody ever knew about it. They kept it as a secret, and they both felt good about it. How do you feel about that? He asked these subjects, and everybody's like, what? No. Okay, why is it wrong? Well, she might get pregnant. No, 2 forms of birth control. Oh, well, but it'll harm their relationship. No, it made their relationship even stronger. Well, people will find out. No, they kept it a secret. Oh, I don't know. It's just gross. Right?
It's icky and wrong, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. In the book, when I was talking about the moral foundation stuff, it was in part because I used some of those very vignettes in some of my studies where, so I did the backpacking in Europe and tried incest for fun vignette. And then we do a task where we gauge people's intuitions of like, well, who do you think these people are? So we describe the people engaging in incest, and people's intuition is, well, they must be atheists. So we could do that with some of his other moral violations. So he has another purity one where you describe Catherine works in a medical school pathology lab, and they work with cadavers, and they have this cadaver that they're done with the next day. It's going to be cremated, and she thinks this is a waste of perfectly good meat. So she chops some people meat off, and takes it home and cooks it and eats it. Again, we have this intuition of like, gross, no, that's wrong. But in my studies, then we say, all right, well, we gauge people's intuitions, and they think, well, Catherine must be an atheist. So cannibalism they associate with atheism. We can describe, we have incest, we have cannibalism. We have one where we describe somebody who's just kind of your classic stereotypical serial killer. So he harms animals as a kid, and then as he grows up, he's not getting much thrill from hurting animals, and he starts hurting people. And our little vignette closes by saying that he has the disembodied bodies of 5 homeless people buried in his basement. And then we look at people's intuitions about who it is, and they assume, yep, this guy must not believe in God. So the serial killer can't believe in God.
That is really disturbing that we still have that prejudice. But I guess there's let's just think about this as an underlying rationality behind it, like the Mark and Julia.
I'm changing my view real quick, sorry, because I have to plug in. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no. Yeah, don't let your power go out. That in fact, there's a reason for the incest taboo to exist, because in fact, if Mark and Julia, brother and sister, were having sex anytime before the birth control pill and so forth, they probably would get pregnant, and that is not good genetically. Again, there's kind of the taboos arise that these religions are tapping into things that in the ancestry, our evolutionary ancestry, actually made sense.
Yeah, exactly. In that case, the intuition is tracking here. I'll get a better angle for you. It is tracking something of, fitness relevance. And I think a lot of our moral intuitions are that way, where, because at least in the Heights work, he talks about how, morality is, you've got the rider trying to move the elephant. and your kind of rational thought, that's the rider. And it can steer the elephant a little, but the elephant in this case is your moral intuitions. And the elephant, it's kind of going to go where it wants to go.
Yeah. But trying to disentangle morality from religion is very difficult for most people. That again, that seems to be one of those things that's like a folk, whatever you want to call it, folk morality, that there has to be some outside source, that reason by itself is not enough. Again, I do these debates and I make all the arguments, Rawlsian just society and, Kant's, categorical imperative and Peter Singer's expanding moral sphere and the principle of interchangeable perspectives and the golden rule. All these things you can present game theory for why it makes sense for people to be altruistic and cooperative and so on and so forth. And that never feels right to people. Most people I present this to. I mean, it's purely intellectual. And there just seems to be this deep intuitive folk sense that there has to be an outside source, and thus God and religion.
I've had some fun sometimes where, you describe, the veil of ignorance, and everybody will understand that and say, oh yeah, that would be good. I could see how you'd get a more fair society if it was designed in a way that you don't know where you're going to get plugged into that society. But then if you propose making like collective choices within your friend group around that, a lot of times like, no, like, I know I agreed and I said that seemed good for society, but for us, no, I still want this thing. That should come to me first.
Right. So there's an intuition there, but also the, kind of the outside source. Like if God didn't command it, divine command theory, that seems to be so deeply embedded. Even in really intellectual theologians, they present the thing I just said and they go, oh yeah, of course, that's all great. But that's not enough. Ultimately, if there's no God, then Hitler got away with it. I mean, that's kind of what the standard line you hear.
One of the things I tried to argue in the book, and it's one of these ones where, I don't have super compelling evidence, but I was thinking like in a lot of kind of modern society, people do treat religion and morality as in effect synonymous, or they'll assume that morality must be grounded in religion. And I'm guessing that historical linkage doesn't go back all that far. So I think that's a consequence of these big gods religions spreading, because they made, religion helped cement cooperation. And so then we have, centuries and millennia of religions are where the cooperation stuff came from. That's how the institutions got started, which, in everybody's psychology, then we get this linkage between religion and morality. And I think that's what's driving some of those kind of quirky effects where I describe people having incest and people assume that they're atheists. I describe a serial killer and people assume they're atheists. I think it's just because we've got that kind of intuitive linkage of morality is religious, morality is religious, morality is religious. And we have some evidence coming out just now where it's even atheists in secular countries seem to show similar patterns where if we can ask them in a tricky enough way, they'll give kind of pro-religious, anti-atheist answers in our quirky little surveys.
Oh, no. Yeah. But the punishment of atheists in that sense, through the stereotyping of them as being amoral or lacking values and so on, is that just for punishing me, the atheist, or is it a social signal to everybody in the society? Don't go down this road because look what we're going to do to you if you do.
Oh, interesting. I like that idea that each individual might be like extra shitty to one atheist because they're trying to signal to everybody else who's on the fence. You don't want to be one of these because you're fair game in this community. That's interesting. That's worth playing with. Sometimes in our surveys, in the ones where we were looking at the kind of indirectly measuring atheist prevalence, we had some questions that we asked people of, in your community, do you feel like it's bad to not be religious? In your community, would you be punished if you were openly atheist? So we tried to gauge that kind of like, how much do people feel like they'd be an outsider if they were? And sure enough, in the places where people are agreeing with that and saying like, yeah, you have to be religious. These are the places where we're seeing a big gap between the self-report and indirect measurements of atheist prevalence, which totally makes sense. These people have picked up the signal that if I step out of line and say I'm an atheist, I'm going to get swatted down.
We have a discussion of that in our latest issue of Skeptic of cancel culture. I mean, who's cancel culture really for? I mean, J.K. Rowling, you can't cancel J.K. Rowling. She's a billionaire, right? What are you going to do? But it isn't for her. It's for everybody else who's not a billionaire. This also came up with when the Linguistic Society, I forget the name of it, tried to cancel Steven Pinker for something he wrote in Better Angels of Our Nature about some people he didn't properly moralize against. He was just trying to understand why they're committing violence, and so, but. And then people pointed out, how are you going to cancel Steven Pinker? I mean, he's at the top of his game. He's a tenured professor at Harvard. He's got plenty of money and he's successful and so on. And then somebody pointed out, well, it isn't for him. It's for the people, the young, untenured associate professors and assistant professors who may want to speak out. But look what they tried to do to Pinker. I have no chance, so I'm going to keep my mouth shut. Anyway, that was just one theory about cancel culture.
I mean, my take on a lot of that stuff is I think a lot of and I'm guessing this is one where you and I disagree. I think a lot of the like fears of cancel culture in higher ed, I don't think there's nearly as much of an issue there as all the attention that's been paid to it, I guess. Yeah, I don't know all the ins and outs of the Pinker one, but I think they just took him off like their list of preferred speakers because, for various reasons. But yeah, I mean, my experience, I'm no longer in the States, obviously, so I can't comment on U.S. higher ed, but when I was there, it wasn't a censorious campus where we all had to worry about the campus leftists canceling speakers. Once a year, we'd have, the anti-abortion people showing us pictures of dead fetuses on the way to the lecture hall. The student center had a mural that showed the town's slave market. And yeah, it was vibrant. People could talk about different ideas, and then I'd read kind of op-ed after op-ed of, the censorious left is ruining higher ed. And I'm like, well, they must be looking at different campuses than the one I'm at.
Yeah, I share some of those sentiments. The problem is the availability heuristic at work here. If you watch Fox News and with the weekly campus craziness clips, every week there's some crazy blue-haired person screaming and yelling and bouncing around on campus, and you're like, whoa. But if you go to college campuses, you don't see anything like that. It's just the kind of bucolic places where the kids are holed up in the dorm and everybody's just peacefully having fun. So I think it's probably not nearly the problem, people made it out to be. But in any case. All right, let's talk about, related to this, that societies need religion to be healthy, stable, successful societies. What is the evidence for this? Is it true, or do they not need that? And if not, then why do we hear that so often in modern politics, especially?
Yeah, I mean, I think I forget which exact chapter it is in the book. It's 8 or 9 somewhere. I try to say, all right, we had one chapter where we look at moral perceptions of atheists, where sure enough, people think the atheists are puppy kicking, Canadian feigning, chicken fucking poker cheats. And then the next chapter is like, well, are they? And in that one, it opens up saying, well, if we want to see whether these stereotypes of atheists are true, one thing we could do is just look at parts of the world where there's lots of atheists and, are we seeing sky high rates of incest and serial murder? And so, yeah, if you look at work looking in, say, Scandinavia and a lot of Western Europe, these are, some of the healthiest, safest, calmest societies we've seen. And a lot of them, punch above their weight class, economically speaking. They have good, healthy social safety nets. You see lots of, promising news towards universal basic income, things like that, where, if people are down on their luck and having problems, the emphasis is on helping these people get back on their feet using, collected public funds. Now, in those societies, it could be that building the kind of thriving social safety net is what's driving religion away. So we can't say the causal arrow goes from these places became atheist and then they developed kind of, healthy socialist programs for securing, kind of the well-being of their citizenry. But if atheists were really as bad as the stereotype goes, Scandinavia would be a hellhole. Like it would be just, chicken buggery and serial murder all over the place. And that's not what we see. These are perfectly healthy, thriving societies.
Yeah, that's the point I make when I cite some of those studies like Phil Zuckerman's Society Without God. I love that book. He was on the show talking about that. But then to say that, like America is a standout in terms of like abortion rates, STD rates, infant mortality, crime, homicides, gun violence, and so on. But I don't want to say that religion's the cause of that because we're such a Christian nation. Look at all the problems we have because each of those has its own separate causal vectors that cause those things. But the point is that if religion is such a great prophylactic against immoral behavior, how come it's not working so well in the United States? So maybe it has nothing to do with that. There's something else at work there.
Yeah, I mean, if you could somehow find a way, magic wand will make it so you can't see religion in a society, but you could decide whether to live in one of the highly secular countries or one of the most religious countries on earth. Otherwise, most people would probably pick the highly secular countries because these are thriving kind of multicultural democracies for the most part. Good social safety nets, and there's complex historical reasons. We're not saying that it's places that are more religious have built we're in part, we can see Scandinavia secularized so fast post World War II and most of Western Europe, in part because, they've spent centuries plundering wealth from the rest of the globe. So these are the places that had the financial wherewithal to build societies that secularized, and the places where they've been looting the money for centuries and resources, they're still quite religious because the money it takes to secularize was all whisked off to Europe over the centuries. So we're starting with some kind of archival data analysis projects to look at kind of extensive colonialism as a driving factor in why we see secularization in some places but not others. And it's just tracking flows of wealth over history.
Yeah, go to the Vatican and look at their artwork collection they have there. Where did they get all that? Yeah, and it's like some of my friends that are skeptical and critical of Scientology. They're going out of business at any moment. It's like they have like billions of dollars in real estate in L.A. and Florida. You really think they're just going to fold all that up? No, I don't think so.
I think they're doing all right. Yeah,
they have deep pockets. All right, so I'm going to read from your book again here. And after 9/11. You're referencing Dawkins again. Dawkins waited just 4 days after 9/11 to publish an infamous piece titled Religion's Misguided Missiles. I remember that. It was a powerful piece. He's such a good writer. That pinned the blame for the attack squarely on religious faith. In that piece, Dawkins writes that, quote, testosterone-sodden young men too unattractive to get a woman in this world might be desperate enough to go for 72 private virgins in the next. Before expanding the claim, quote, religion is also, of course, the underlying source of the divisiveness in the Middle East, which motivated the use of this deadly weapon in the first place. To fill the world with religion, or religions of the Abrahamic kind, is like littering the streets with loaded guns. And then you continue. According to Christopher Hitchens, religion is inherently violent, irrational, intolerant, allied to racism, tribalism, and bigotry. The subtitle of his book, God is Not Great, is Religion Poisons Everything. I remember I loved his book and I loved Hitch, and I knew him well. But it's like, everything? Really? I mean, everything? They man the soup kitchens.
Everything's a lot of things. Yeah.
That's a lot of things. They man the soup kitchens in LA. Isn't that a good thing?
Yeah.
And then you quote Sam Harris, a glance at history reveals that ideas which divide one group of human beings from another, only to unite them in slaughter, generally have their roots in religion. And then you recommend Scott Atran's book, Talking to the Enemy, written by a global expert in both religious cognition and terrorism. Atran sought to discover what motivates suicide terrorists by combining both quantitative and qualitative research, as well as his own experiences conducting this research. So I was at this Beyond Belief conference around that time. I think it was 2004, maybe, around the time that the New Atheist books were coming, just before that, at the Salk Institute. So Sam Harris was there, Dawkins, and Scott Atran was there. And Scott and Sam kind of got into it. And they were going back and forth about this. And I thought they both made good points. Anyway, so I just thought I'd get your thoughts on this. To what extent is modern terrorism that we're dealing with now, particularly in the Middle East, religiously motivated? So that'd be Sam and Hitch and Dawkins. Or Atran, it's more, I don't know, political, sociocultural, and it has many different vectors, and religious is secondary, or I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, on this one, I think it makes some sense to go with Scott Atran because he's actually a scientist who's studied these things. He's gone on the ground and talked to people in these hotbed zones. He's collected data. He's talked to other scientists. I think the science over the years has been pretty clear that religion is implicated in a lot of conflict because religion's a cross-cultural human universal, and it's implicated in pretty much everything. But yeah, Scott would say in that book and elsewhere, or work by like Jeremy Ginges and others, when you actually do well-designed studies to try to tease apart the motivations of, terrorists, people engaged in what looks like transparently religious conflict, Scott would say, a suicide terrorist is somebody who is willing to give his life for his friends, not for his God, but for his friends. And if you look at which factors predict kind of willingness to engage in suicide terrorism or support for suicide terrorism, uh, a strong predictor is things that are associated with kind of coalitional allegiance. So if you ask, even if we just stick to religious variables, this is work with Jeremy Genges, Aaron Ornstein, and Ian Hansen, I think. If you look at frequency of religious attendance, so attendance at church, mosque, synagogue, etc., that tracks kind of your in-group alliances. I'm going to the place where my people hang out regularly. Whereas something like frequency of private prayer, that's your kind of spiritual connection to God. And if we look at which one predicts support for suicide terrorism, it's the church stuff. It's not the prayer stuff. So yeah, to that extent, we could say this is religious stuff driving conflict, but it's the religious stuff that's specific to hanging out with my buddies. So yeah, I would definitely default to Scott Atran just because he's the one doing the work.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, anything in human social behavior and action has to be multi-causal. Nothing in human behavior has a single cause. So I agree. And you can pick and choose passages or some of these self-published little magazines in which they say, we hate you because you're a Christian or whatever, or you're an infidel if you're not Islamic. If you're not a Muslim, then, well, look, he said that right there. Okay, you can pick and choose passages from pretty much any holy book.
Everything's multi-causal, and then we're a religious species, and so religion's going to be bound up with everything all the time.
Yeah.
The question is it uniquely bound up with stuff? And in terms of conflict, it's like, yeah, we'll see conflict across religious lines, but that doesn't mean necessarily it's something intrinsic to religion causing the conflict, or if it's religion's a human universal, and when people are fighting, religion's something to fight about.
Okay, we're about to colonize Mars, so we start a new colony of humans on Mars. 1,000 years from now, will there be half a dozen religions and they'll have religious wars and conflicts because it's in our nature? Or does it depend who goes? Or might it be completely different because it's a different culture?
I would have to go with the last one. I think we're founding a new culture. So it's going to depend on, what's the makeup of the founders heading there. Also, cultures change over time, so we might get new emerging stuff. I think we could confidently say that 1,000 years hence on Mars, everybody's going to have the psychological ability to easily and intuitively imagine gods. That's kind of what we were saying was the byproduct stuff, the capacity for religion. I think with those people on Mars in 1,000 years, would they have something we recognize as religion? Tough to tell. The cultural evolution is unpredictable. I'm guessing that, I don't think we could predict enough about what their culture would look like in 1,000. So they would have the capacity for religion. I think whether they have something that looks like what we would recognize as religion, it kind of depends on too many factors we don't know between now and then.
Yeah. Well, they'll certainly need political and economic systems, so that's always fun to think about, too. What will they end up with? Elon said it have to be a direct democracy. It's like, yeah, okay, but if you have 1 million people, you can't have a direct democracy. It just doesn't work that way, right? Then you get the tyranny.
Is he behind abolishing the Electoral College then to make it more direct?
Well, I don't know. He's whatever he is today is probably different from tomorrow. Who knows? Yeah. But, okay, another one of these movements that I witnessed was, as atheism was taking off, is, we need to replace religion with something. And I remember thinking, really? Because I don't really feel it, but maybe that's just me. There's all these like secular humanist groups you can go to, the meetup coffee things. There was one for atheists in LA where they would get together. Oh, it was a Universal Unitarian Church, and they would get together every Sunday in the morning, light candles, and they had hymns singing to Newton and Darwin, and people would get up and give their testimonials about how they abandoned God. It's kind of, and I remember thinking, I was religious for a while. I went to church. I was bored out of my mind. I didn't like it then, and I don't like this either. But maybe that's just me. I don't know. So what are your thoughts in terms of human nature? Do we really need to replace it with something like religion, some kind of structure where you have a big building with glass and hymns and I don't know what.
I mean, I think so. As a individual human, I would side with you of like that does nothing for me. I'm not terribly sociable to begin with, so hanging out with people I don't know on a Sunday morning, ugh, hard pass. Um, but I will say, when we lived in Kentucky for 7 years, so that was kind of right in the thick of the Bible Belt.
Oh.
I think I rode past 6 churches in my 15-minute bike ride from my house to the university. It was 6 churches, 3 liquor stores, and a bunch of sorority houses.
And a gun store.
And a gun store, yeah, Kentucky, y'all. And it was fun, love living there. But we really noticed that so pretty quickly I was contacted by kind of local atheist groups who, had heard about, this guy actually studies this stuff. So they were interested in having me come give talks, and got to be friends with a lot of these people. And so you would see kind of thriving non-religious communities in a way that I didn't recognize from when I was living in Vancouver or even in Colorado growing up, where it seemed like in a highly religious area, we really saw how being a positively identified atheist with a community that felt more meaningful than it does in a more secular place where it's like nobody's religious. Why are you making a fan club about it? And we could also feel, that you can see in communities where religion is providing so much for so many people. If you're not religious, you're left out of, on Sunday morning, you go to church, there's stuff to entertain the kids, there's Sunday school. So a lot of just kind of important social stuff gets routed through church in some places. So I could see how a lot of people would say it'd be nice to have a secular alternative for all of that community building stuff. I'm a bit less convinced on saying, oh, we can just take church and then we try to remove the supernatural stuff and that will fulfill the same purpose. It's one of these ones where it's like, in principle, I get where you guys are coming from. I think building secular identity is important, especially in places where being non-religious is more kind of socially loaded and stigmatized. It's not necessarily for me, these groups, but I can get the temptation to want to build these communities. Will they work? Will they stick? I'm not sure. We're kind of at a fun stage where it seems like there's a lot of different experiments in the air where people are trying different ways to get this non-religious community. And it'll be fascinating to see kind of what sticks over time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they do a lot of good things. Again, manning the soup kitchen or, raising money for people that need help and so on. That, and secular groups that have tried to do that, they tend to not be as successful. Or organized religion is really good at, getting everybody to get out there and do this thing we need to, help with. So.
Yeah. When we were moving in there, it's like, if only I would have been Baptist, I would have known where to go Sunday morning and I would have left with 50 friends.
All right, Will, thanks for your time. Thanks for your book. Again, here it is, Disbelief, The Origins of Atheism. It's really about the origins of religion, God beliefs, God disbeliefs, and so on. It's really a fascinating book. And what are you working on next?
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you again for having me. What am I working on next? Oh, not
research
decided.
Projects or whatever. Okay.
Research projects. We're trying to do a bit of work now looking at, I briefly hinted at, of whether non-religious people in majority secular societies might still have some weird pro-religious intuitions if we can ask the right trick questions is one project.
Interesting.
Yeah, we'll see. Maybe there's another book in there at some point, but
okay, there you go.